It's the middle of the night. A floorboard creaks in the room next to yours. Your whole body goes still. You tell yourself it's nothing. The house settling. The wind. But for most of human history, your ancestors would not have gone back to sleep. They would have grabbed a shovel, because to them, the thing making that sound wasn't a person anymore. It was something that used to be a person, something that had come back. You picture a vampire, and you see pale skin, a black cape, sharp white fangs glinting under a full moon. That image is barely 200 years old. It came from a novel. The real story is far older and far stranger. It didn't begin in a castle in Transylvania. It began in muddy graveyards across Eastern Europe, where terrified villagers dug up their own neighbors with their bare hands, convinced the dead were feeding on the living. This isn't folklore dressed up for a campfire. This actually happened. Government officials wrote reports about it. Doctors were sent to investigate. And what they found buried in those graves would end up giving the entire world the word vampire. Start in Serbia, 1725. A peasant named Peter Plogojowitz dies. Within days, 9 of his neighbors fall sick and die too, each one claiming before the end that Plogojowitz had come to them in the night and choked them in their sleep. The village panics. They dig him up. And according to the official Austrian report, a real document filed by an imperial officer, Plogojowitz's body hadn't decomposed the way a corpse should. His hair and nails looked like they'd grown. Fresh blood was at his mouth. The villagers took this as proof. They drove a wooden stake through his chest. Witnesses swore that blood poured from the wound and that the body groaned as it happened. 2 years later, in the same region, a former soldier named Arnold Paole dies falling from a hay wagon. He'd once claimed he was tormented by a vampire in his youth, but that he'd cured himself by eating dirt from the vampire's grave. After his death, 4 people in his village die under mysterious circumstances. The community exhumes him. Same story. Undecomposed body. Blood at the mouth. New skin underneath old skin, like he'd been renewed. This case got so much attention that the Austrian government sent a military doctor to write a full medical report. That report reached Vienna. It reached Paris. It reached London. And that is the exact moment the word vampire entered the English language. Not from a story, but from a government document trying to explain a corpse that wouldn't behave the way everyone expected. So why did the bodies look like that? Why did dead men seem to have fresh blood, longer nails, growing hair? This is where the science gets stranger than the superstition. A researcher named Paul Barber spent years studying these old vampire reports as a forensic problem, not a folklore problem. He published his findings in a book called Vampires, Burial and Death, and what he found was that 18th century villagers were accurately observing a decomposing body. They just didn't know what they were looking at. Skin shrinks and pulls back after death, which makes nails and hair look longer, even though they've stopped growing. Gases build up inside the abdomen, which can push dark fluid up through the mouth and nose. Fluid that looks exactly like fresh blood if you're holding a torch in the dark and terrified. That same gas buildup means a body can groan, hiss, or even seem to sit up slightly when a stake is driven into it. Not because it's alive, because it's full of trapped air looking for a way out. Every single sign of vampirism had a biological explanation. Nobody had one yet. Germ theory didn't exist. Forensic science didn't exist. so people built the only explanation available to them. Something evil was reanimating the dead. But decomposition alone doesn't explain why entire families were dying in these outbreaks. That part is even darker, and it happened closer to home than Eastern Europe. It happened in New England, and it happened far more recently than you'd think. In 1892, in the small town of Exeter, Rhode Island, a farmer named George Brown had already buried his wife and one daughter to tuberculosis. Back then, it was called consumption, because that's what it looked like doing to a person, consuming them alive, wasting them down to nothing over months. When his second daughter, Mercy, began dying of the same disease, and his son grew sick too, the townspeople convinced George that one of his already dead family members was rising from the grave at night to drain the life from the ones still living. This wasn't a superstition from centuries ago. This was 1892. Newspapers existed. Trains existed. And still, they exhumed all three bodies. An anthropologist named Michael Bell later documented dozens of cases exactly like this across New England in a study he called the vampire folk belief. He found that these families weren't ignorant or unusually superstitious. They were desperate. Tuberculosis was killing them in a pattern nobody could explain. Person after person in the same household, wasting away in sequence. Without knowing about bacteria, without knowing about contagion, the only pattern that made sense was that the first person to die was somehow still feeding on the ones left behind. When they exhumed Mercy Brown, her body, only buried 2 months, in a cold New England winter, hadn't decomposed the way they expected. They took this as confirmation. They cut out her heart, burned it on a rock, and made her dying brother drink the ashes mixed with medicine, hoping it would break the vampire's hold on him. He died anyway, weeks later. Do you see the pattern forming yet? A disease spreads through a household in a sequence nobody can explain. The living get sicker as the dead stay silent in the ground. And rather than accept an invisible, nameless cause, people gave it a face. A hungry, dead face, in the room next to theirs. There's one more piece of this, and it might be the strangest. In 1998, a neurologist named Juan Gómez-Alonso published a study in the journal Neurology, proposing that some vampire behavior described in old folklore lines up disturbingly well with the symptoms of rabies. Rabies can cause aggression, insomnia, and a strange sensitivity to strong smells and bright light, which may explain the old belief that vampires hate garlic and avoid mirrors, since mirrors were often silvered with substances that produced a smell rabid patients found intolerable. Gómez-Alonso also found that rabies outbreaks in dogs and wolves spiked across the Balkans in the exact years of the worst vampire panics. An infected wolf bite. A person becomes ill, aggressive, afraid of light. Neighbors watch a person they know behave like something inhuman. And once again, no one had the word virus. So they reached for the only word they had. Here's the twist underneath all of it. The vampire was never really about the dead. It was about disease nobody could see, moving through a family, a village, a bloodline, with no visible cause and no way to stop it. Before anyone understood contagion, the vampire was the closest thing humans had to a working theory of infection. A monster with a face was easier to live with than an invisible killer with none. And you still do this. You just don't call it a vampire anymore. Think about the last time something spread through your community and no one could explain it fast enough. A virus, a rumor, A wave of people getting sick at the same time. Notice how quickly people reach for someone to blame. A patient zero, a conspiracy, a single face that made the invisible feel controllable. That instinct is not new. It is the same instinct that sent villagers into a graveyard with a shovel 300 years ago. Humans have never been comfortable with a threat that has no shape, so they give it one, even if that shape is wrong. Somewhere between Serbia in 1725 and Rhode Island in 1892, this pattern repeats itself with almost no variation. A person dies. Others around them sicken. The community, staring at a threat it cannot name, reaches for the one thing scarier than disease. The idea that the dead do not stay dead. It was never really about blood. It was about the terror of not knowing why people you love keep disappearing. So the next time a floorboard creaks in the room next to yours and your whole body goes still, remember what you're actually afraid of. It was never the thing in the dark. It was always the thing you couldn't explain.